OsteoSignal Episode 34.
Dopamine is not the villain. Why dopamine scrolling gets the science backward, and what fractionated sleep, duodenal nutrient depletion, and glymphatic failure actually have to do with your child who can't put down the phone.
This is OsteoSignal with Neal O'Neill, a podcast exploring how osteopathic science can help you decode the body's biomechanical, biochemical, and bioelectrical signals so you can thrive. And now, here's Neal.
Welcome back to the OsteoSignal podcast. My name is Neal O'Neill. I'm a clinical osteopathic manual therapist and physical therapist. My work focuses on translating complex physiology, neuroendocrine signaling, biomechanics, immune regulation, and nervous system function into the hands-on clinical methods that help restore adaptive capacity in patients. Much of my perspective comes from years of clinical practice combined with training in translational research, where the goal is to bridge the gap between laboratory science and what actually helps people recover function in the clinic. Joining me is Autumn Mayberry, a fellow osteopathic manual therapist whose work focuses on integrating structural treatment with the body's autonomic, endocrine, and visceral systems. Autumn brings a deep clinical perspective to these discussions and helps ground many of the concepts we talk about in real patient care. Hey, Autumn.
Hey, Neal, how's it going?
Going well. And helping guide the conversation is Brent Mayberry, our podcast facilitator. Brent is an engineer by training, which makes him the perfect person to ask the kinds of questions that many listeners are probably already thinking, helping translate some of the deeper physiological concepts into language that is clear, practical, and understandable. In a previous episode, we went deep into the neurology of chronic fatigue, how low ferritin impairs dopamine synthesis through tyrosine hydroxylase, how that creates the wired but exhausted state, how the glymphatic system of the brain fails when sleep architecture fragments, and how this entire cascade produces a patient who is profoundly exhausted and completely unable to rest. Today's episode is a follow-up to that conversation, and it starts with something that's been bothering me for a while. Something I keep hearing in the media from wellness influencers and even from some clinicians, and that is the idea that dopamine is the villain. You've heard the language, dopamine scrolling, dopamine addiction, your child is addicted to dopamine hits from their phone, social media hijacks your dopamine system, video games are dopamine factories. The implication is always the same. Dopamine is a dangerous pleasure chemical. Screens exploit it, and the solution is to restrict access to the trigger. Take away the phone, limit the screen time, do a dopamine detox. I want to push back on this, not because the screens are harmless. They're not. And the design of social media platforms absolutely manipulates attention and reward systems. But because the framing puts the blame on the molecule and completely ignores the metabolic and neurological conditions that make the behavior necessary in the first place. Dopamine is not the villain. Dopamine is the victim. And until we understand that, we're going to keep punishing kids and adults for a behavior that is, in many cases, a symptom of a depleted brain trying to maintain minimum functional capacity with whatever stimulus is cheapest and most available. Okay, and yes, that's a strong claim. I'm saying that doom scrolling isn't a dopamine excess problem. It's a dopamine scarcity problem. Okay? And we're going to build the case for this step by step. So let's get into it. What dopamine actually does. Let me reestablish what dopamine is, because the popular narrative has distorted it so badly that we need to start from scratch. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. That's serotonin's domain. Dopamine is the transition chemical. It's the signal that enables you to disengage from one activity and engage with another. It's the neurological currency of cognitive and behavioral flexibility, the ability to shift gears. When dopamine is adequate in the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia, you can finish watching a video and decide to do something else. You can put down the phone and start homework. You can end a conversation and shift your attention to a new task. You can stop eating when you're full. You can wake up and get out of bed with a sense of forward momentum. These are all gear-shifting operations, and they all require dopamine. When dopamine is insufficient, gear shifting becomes effortful to the point of impossibility. The current activity, whatever it is, persists not because it's supremely rewarding, but because the brain literally cannot generate the signal to transition away from it. The behavior looks like addiction. It looks like obsession. It looks like a child who is choosing the phone over homework. But neurologically, it's a brain that has run out of the currency it needs to make the switch.
Yeah, I see this with my kids in my practice all the time, Neil. Like they come in and they're not engaged, they're not excited about stuff. They're kind of just like meh all the time. And they're not happy. And but like you've been saying, we've been taught all the time that this it's the dopamine is the problem. And so I'm excited you're doing this because we've been talking about it a little bit, but this is gonna really help
Exactly.
parents make the right choices with regards to this stuff. It's gonna be good.
Right. And to see beneath, the things that are going on and see past that of blaming the phone, blaming the kid. Yeah. So that really is the tell, the inertia of the child coming in or the adult, right? The tell is in the
Hmm.
inertia. If the behavior were generally driven by dopamine excess, by overwhelming pleasure, the person would look animated, engaged, lit up. Instead, they look glazed, right? They look zombie-like. They're perseverating, right? They're perseverating, not enjoying. They're stuck in the current activity because the energy to shift out of it isn't available. The phone isn't giving them too much dopamine. The phone is the last thing still providing enough stimulation to keep the depleted brain system running at baseline. So if the question comes up, why the brain is depleted. So let's look at the supply side. So if the problem isn't too much dopamine from screens, what's actually happening? The answer is on the supply side, not the demand side. We covered this in detail in the previous episode, but let me lay out the full dopamine supply chain because it starts in the duodenum and ends in the substantia nigra, basal nuclei of the brain. And there are failure points at every step. Step one is dietary intake. Dopamine is synthesized from amino acid tyrosine, which comes from dietary protein. Tyrosine is absorbed primarily in the small intestine. That's the raw material. Is the child getting enough protein? Step two is duodenal nutrient absorption. And this is the piece that gets almost no attention in the dopamine conversation. The, the duodenum, the first 25 centimeters or 12 inches of the small intestine, is the primary absorption site, not just for tyrosine, but for iron, zinc, folate, and B vitamins. All of these nutrients are required for dopamine synthesis. Iron is the cofactor for tyrosine hydroxylase. Zinc is required for dopamine receptor function and for the storage of dopamine in synaptic vesicles, right? The synapse is the part of the act of the nerve where it's about to tell another nerve, give it some message. Folate and B6 participate in the methylation pathways that regulate neurotransmitter metabolism. Vitamin C is required for the conversion of dopamine to norepinephrine by dopamine beta hydroxylase. If duodenal absorption is compromised by gut inflammation, by celiac disease, by ultra-processed food, which leads to LPS, lipopolysaccharide, by chronic NSAID use, by gut dysbiosis, by the kind of gut barrier dysfunction we discussed in the gut peptide quartet episode last week, the raw materials for dopamine synthesis never make it into the blood supply. The substrate is eaten, it's just not absorbed. So yeah,
So so a lot of this kids from how it comes from how our kids are eating and probably not being active enough, right?
not being active enough, right, because that helps get rid of gut inflammation. Anything that would help gut inflammation, eating those ultra processed foods, uh, just you know, basic, too much sugar, too much this, too much that, and then they get that, or having had a disease as a child and never having fully recovered the signaling pathways. For example, Epstein-Barr virus, stomach flus, those derail people's intestinal tracts, and they don't necessarily come back online without help. And
See,
and that's one.
this is fascinating too, because we know when we treat brain things and developmental things, we're always going to have the small intestine, involved. But this is great to have the itemized things, and we're like, oh, if they also have an iron problem, or if they have, they don't methylate folate very well, or they have vitamin B deficiency, it kind of helps you tie those things in too, and be like, don't forget the small intestine and the duodenum.
Exactly. In fact, you see a lot of physicians suggest that when we see deficiencies, that maybe before we do an MTHFR test, that some kids should just be getting methylated B12 to begin with, to make sure that they don't have to have that extra step of breaking it down. Always worth looking for that gene as well, but also like a colicky kid, just as you say, colicky kids, like there's something going on. Just right off the bat. Didn't happen. Maybe they didn't get the right gut microbiome. Certainly we see that in C-section kids, that they don't
Yep.
necessarily
I
get
was
the
just gonna say
same
that.
gut. Yeah. I stole your thunder. All
That's
right.
okay. I'm glad I'm tracking with you.
So this is one of the most, this connection is the most commonly missed connection in pediatric practice. A child eating adequate protein, eating adequate iron on paper, whose labs might even show a borderline normal ferritin, but whose duodenal absorption is compromised by subclinical gut inflammation that nobody has investigated, or that has caused the liver to release hepcidin, and that's locking up their iron, so their ferritin or their iron stores may look appropriate, but they're not. That child is functionally iron deficient in the brain. And remember, the brain levels of iron drag behind the rest of the body, right? Because the brain,
They've got to be way
blood,
higher.
they got to be way higher. The blood-brain barrier keeps stuff out. So a functionally iron deficient system in the brain means functionally dopamine deficient brain. And functionally dopamine deficient means they cannot shift gears, right? So they get stuck. So step 3 is enzymatic conversion. Even when the substrate arrives and iron is present, tyrosine hydroxylase has to be functional. This enzyme requires iron in its ferrous state, and it requires tetrahydrobiopterin as an additional cofactor. Tetrahydrobiopterin synthesis requires folate, which brings us back to the duodenal absorption question again. It's a cascade, and the gut is the entry point. And like you said, you see tons of kids with midgut, what we call midgut or small intestine dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
What does what does that look like in kids? Is it kind of the symptoms you've already spelled out?
Transitions are hard.
Well, and what you see in these kids is that they're colicky, they're gut aches, they're really thin. The parents will complain that they don't eat well, they don't sleep well. So sometimes you can't tell that the gut is inflamed itself. They may have an enlarged abdomen, like just some swelling in their abdomen. It looks like they have a little quote unquote beer gut or whatever, but it'll be this inflammation in the intestinal tract, particularly around the navel or just above the navel. So yeah, it's sometimes hard to see, and because a lot of kids get chubby and then they grow, right? And so it's always hard to say, is that gut inflammation or is that just normal growth process? So it can be a little hard to see that way. That's why, how much blood testing are we doing on children? Almost none, right? It almost never happens. And then that is problematic because we just assume everybody is normal. And we know what happens when we make assumptions. We look really stupid is what happens, because there are always those people who aren't the norm, even when we assume that they're the norm. So that can be very problematic.
Yeah, I think even I think maybe the abdomen is proportionally distended. Is that kind of a sign of inflammation?
It can
compared
be.
to the rest of the body?
Exactly. Yeah, you'll definitely see the distension. Yep. Bloating.
Yeah, I think we have some of that in our family.
I think it's really hard to miss.
I can see that symptoms, yeah.
Right. And we talked about
but it's interesting. Nobody's really addressing it. It sounds like then
nobody's even talking about it or saying, "Hey, be on the lookout for this." Right.
Right.
And then now step 4 is adequate sleep for dopamine receptor resensitization. You have to, those dopamine receptors, you have to lay off. If they're constantly being stimulated, you have to lay off that. So there has to be adequate sleep for the resensitization. So during slow wave sleep, dopamine receptors undergo a process of resensitization. They reset their responsiveness so that the same amount of dopamine produces an appropriate signal the next day. When sleep is fractionated, when the patient isn't getting consolidated slow wave cycles, that deep sleep, the receptors don't fully reset. Then the next day, the existing dopamine produces a weaker signal. The brain responds by seeking stronger stimuli to achieve the same baseline activation. So you might see that the child's not doing well in school because if the teacher doesn't know to speak louder or engage the kids more or really get them moving, because some days those kids are going to need more activation, and it's just because of poor sleep the night before. So this is what it looks like. Tolerance, so it looks like tolerance or addiction, but it's actually a receptor sensitivity problem caused by poor sleep, not by excess dopamine. And here's where it kind of overlaps Parkinsonism, is that in some Parkinson's patients, they've shown that it's not that they don't produce enough dopamine, it's that the cells have stopped being sensitive to it. Exactly this same problem. In this situation, we're talking about changing from one activity to the next and phones and social media. But in that situation, we're talking about all of life. Simple things like walking from one room with a floor pattern, like say a rug is in one room, and then you walk into a room with hardwood floor. Those people will get stopped at the door and cannot cross the threshold. And so that's
It's kind of like diabetes in a
Parkinson's.
way.
Yes, exactly. Diabetes, causes cardiovascular problems, but this is the same thing. You have inflammation in an area and you don't get the right nutrition. It doesn't absorb right. It can't be used properly. And inflammation gets in the way of everything happening, including locking up the iron. So exactly. We have
And that
so much going
sensitivity
on.
gets messed up.
And the sensitivity gets messed up. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like insulin sensitivity gets screwed up.
Yes.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Exactly.
So we'd want to do this in our type 1 diabetes kids and kids that are maybe, obviously needing to shed some of their weight and, get moving better and eating better for sure.
Exactly. And this could be the thing this is the thing that maybe the parents bring them in for, saying, oh, yeah, they're just so addicted to that phone. Maybe there's something you can do. So hopefully we can all, take a note from this and improve our who we can tell people like, hey, this is what we're looking for, these kind of problems. Okay, step 5 is the supply chain deserves its own segment because it's the step that closes the loop and explains why the problem is self-reinforcing, right? It's not just that it happens, it's that it actually becomes self-reinforcing. So we introduced the glymphatic system in that previous episode, but let me go deeper. The glymphatic system, named for its dependence on glial cells, right, support cells in the brain, and its functional similarity to the lymphatic system in the brain, this is the brain's waste clearance network. It was discovered in 2012 by Micah Niedergard and colleagues, and it was first confirmed in living human brains just a couple of years ago in 2024. Right? We actually have video of this occurring during deep wave sleep. So pretty cool.
Crazy.
Now during consolidated slow wave sleep, the interstitial spaces between brain cells expand by approximately 60%. Huge. Cerebral spinal fluid flows through these expanded spaces via paravascular channels, pathways running alongside blood vessels, and it flushes metabolic waste out of the brain tissue. Now, the system depends on water channels called aquaporin 4 or AQP4, which are concentrated on the astrocyte end feet that wrap around the blood vessels, right? So you have a blood vessel, and then these astrocytes have their little feet around it, and that's what makes the blood-brain barrier. So they're concentrated in that so that not only can these chemicals and waste products be cleared through, but then they can be driven through into the arterial system so they can be taken away. Okay, the waste products being cleared include amyloid beta, tau protein, and critically for today's conversation, alpha-synuclein. And alpha-synuclein is a protein that, when it accumulates abnormally around dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra, is the hallmark pathology of Parkinson's disease. Under normal conditions, the glymphatic system clears alpha-synuclein nightly. Under conditions of chronic sleep deprivation or sleep fragmentation, clearance fails and alpha-synuclein accumulates. Now, here's the self-reinforcing loop. Low dopamine impairs sleep quality. Dopamine is involved in circadian regulation and sleep architecture. Poor sleep quality reduces glymphatic clearance. Reduced glymphatic clearance allows metabolic waste to accumulate around dopaminergic neurons. Waste accumulation further impairs dopamine signaling, which further impairs sleep, which further impairs clearance. And around the problem goes, and growing, and in some people ends in Parkinsonism.
That's scary.
So that is scary, right? So the patient, whether they're a 14-year-old doom scrolling at midnight or a 48-year-old who can't stop checking email at 11 p.m., is caught in a neurometabolic loop where each night of poor sleep makes the next day's dopamine supply worse, which makes the next night's sleep worse, which makes the next day's dopamine supply worse. And the screen behavior isn't the cause of the loop. It's what the depleted brain reaches for to maintain that minimum stimulation while the loop tightens and tightens.
Yeah.
I think that's a really key insight to how people, get kind of stuck into doing that kind of routine, is that the brain needs some minimum stimulation, and the phone is super handy and engineered to provide that stimulation, right? And so
Exactly.
So that's a really key insight. It's not the phone that's doing it, it's the body that's using the phone to get what it needs, right? Because the dopamine supply is tanking.
Exactly.
And it's It's and that vicious cycle is man, it sounds like it can be really tough. So hopefully along in this episode we can talk about what to do about it.
But yeah, and as manual therapists, though, we have lots of techniques that are cranial, some designed specifically for for pediatric patients, and some for adults, right? But if we can get the temporal bones, the upper cervicals, and the that cranial rhythm impulse to be right, then that cerebral spinal fluid can actually get through the perivascular spaces, and then that glymphatic system can heal and do its job. And so it doesn't have to be. I mean, if you're kind of feeling like you're stuck in this loop, whether you're an adult or your kid, there's a lot you can do with this. And a lot of manual therapists are already doing a lot of these things, but sometimes we don't realize, hey, this is actually the chemical, like the microscope, look at what we're doing. And I need to be thinking about that and then using it intentionally in that way.
Yeah, that's an essential point. The structural layer intersects with the glymphatic layer. A teenager with chronic upper cervical restriction from forward head posture, of course, from years of looking down at a phone, ironically, may have mechanically compromised cerebrospinal fluid flow that reduces glymphatic clearance, which contributes to the dopamine depletion that makes it harder to put the phone down. The behavior causes the structural pattern that worsens the neurological condition that drives the behavior. Multiple reinforcing loops all converging, like Brent was saying, and they're all coming in there. So it's a very important thing to understand, because by understanding it appropriately and properly, it leads to a better ability to combat the problem, as opposed to other ways of doing that.
Yeah, and it's really great, as Autumn mentioned, that there are manual therapy techniques that can help, get kind of, what's the word, break the dam, so to speak, and get that glymphatic system doing its job.
Right. Yeah. Optimize that function. And as you said, Autumn, with this in mind, taking that microscopic view and understanding what's going on underneath your hands with cranial. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm just trying to feel the rhythm. I'm trying to do this. But when you understand, like, no, I'm trying to drive the glymphatic system and reinforce the astrocyte's ability to maintain its own health and maintain the health of the neurons around it, that changes maybe how you move your fingers, what you're feeling for with your fingers, and what you'll accept as I've done what I needed to do, right? As
Right.
opposed to, well, everything feels like it's puffing. Now, there's a lot of overlap in those two, but nothing improves intuition like knowledge, as our mentor Barry used
Yes.
to love to say. So,
Yep.
yes, exactly.
And you're conscious of a different outcome that you're trying to achieve.
Exactly. Okay, so what the media gets wrong. A 2025 paper in Perspectives in Public Health by Sharp and Spooner introduced the term dopamine scrolling as a distinct public health concern. And they describe it as the habitual scrolling through social media feeds in pursuit of novel, entertaining content, characterized by rapid platform switching, active content seeking, and significant time investment. The paper notes that the behavior operates through variable reinforcement schedules and that platforms deliberately employ design features to maintain engagement: autoplay, pull to refresh, infinite scrolling, and algorithmic content suggestion. And they're right about all of that. The platform design is predatory. The variable reinforcement schedule is real. The time investment is significant. Research cited in the paper indicates that over 1 billion people spend an average of 3 hours daily scrolling through social media, with some countries exceeding 4 hours. But here's what the paper and the broader media narrative gets wrong. They frame the neurobiological basis as small doses of dopamine released with each scrolling motion that lead to tolerance development. The implication is that dopamine is being overstimulated by the platform, and the solution is to reduce stimulation. That's demand side thinking, and it misses the supply side entirely.
So Neal, help me understand why is that distinction between demand side and supply side? Why does that matter?
Okay, perfect. Yeah. It matters because the interventions are completely different. If dopamine scrolling is a demand side problem, too much dopamine stimulation from the platform, then the solution is restriction, limit screen time, block apps, digital detox, reduce the stimulus. And that's what most of the recommendations focus on. But if the behavior is a supply side problem, the person is scrolling because their dopamine is already depleted and the phone is the only stimulus cheap enough to maintain baseline neural activation. They don't have enough energy for anything else. They don't have enough dopamine for anything else. Then restriction without addressing the supply deficit is cruel. You're taking away the one thing that's keeping the depleted brain at minimum function, and you're not giving it anything to replace the shortfall.
Not
Right?
filling the void.
Yeah, exactly. So think about what happens when a parent takes away the phone from a teenager with unrecognized iron deficiency, poor sleep architecture, and an inflamed gut that isn't absorbing nutrients properly. The teenager doesn't suddenly redirect their attention to homework and creative pursuits. They collapse. They stare at the ceiling.
Mhm.
They become irritable, withdrawn, and emotionally dysregulated. Not because they're going through dopamine withdrawal from the phone, but because you've removed the only stimulus propping up a dopamine system that was already running on fumes, and now it has nothing, right? The behavioral outcome of restriction and a depleted brain is not liberation, it's shutdown. And Autumn, I'm sure you've seen this part where parents bring their kid in and the kid's more shut down. It's not like they're in ecstasy with their phone. They're zombies.
Yeah, no. I've even had kids come in saying, "The only reason I'm in here is because my parents told me I could play on the video game when I'm done." And they're mad, you know? But
Exactly.
that's what they do. They like it because it helps them. They still have the rest of the day to get through, and they gotta do stuff, and things are expected of them, and it's how they get through.
Right, and think about it, the demands of all the other things in life. So they're having a hard time just doing their daily things that they need to do, whether that's homework or be in class or interact with adults or take care of this or take care of that. Right, we're constantly trying to bring our kids like, come on, come on, come on, do more, do more. Your future's ahead of you. Do it now, right? Um, and
Mhm.
this is where the clinical frame matters enormously because the difference between your child is addicted to screens and your child's brain may not have the resources to do what you're asking it to do leads to completely different conversations with families and completely different outcomes.
Yep. I just love this though, but if we can talk to the parents and be like, make sure they get enough sleep, work with their diet, get them to do these other things, then they're not going to be like, I'm taking here. And so let me find my phone because I'm distracted. They're subconsciously reaching for something that will help them get through.
Well, and yeah,
And we
exactly.
just
And
need to get,
yeah, we need to get the message
we
out
need to
there because yeah, you had
get
people
them the
who
stuff that works.
yes, exactly, get them the stuff that works. And the sad part is you had some people who don't understand the actual problem. Right, the demand side, they're busy focusing on the demand side because they gave it. This is a little bit like social distancing during COVID. It's like that's not actually the right term, right? It's not like you like unfriended all your friends on Facebook and so you have social distancing. It should have been physical distancing. But again, we have people who don't actually know the correct term, and then it gets used too many times, and now we can't undo the term, even though it's the wrong term and gives the wrong message. So, um, yeah. So, and really, just understanding that it's supply side, and there are things that can be done for that, and there are things that need to be measured for that. Okay, especially with, you have to do blood analysis. You have to do a deeper blood analysis. You need more like some of those blood analyses where they do 150 markers. Certainly, there are things with the peptides that are coming online. I don't know how many people are aware of that, but there are lots and lots of things coming along. They're going to help tremendously with gut inflammation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we already have them. The GLP-1s are for that. There's a GLP-2. There's a GLP-3. There's BPC 157. There's lots of things that are going to help us with that in addition to the osteopathic manual therapy, but that stuff's not here yet. But there are a lot of things that have to be in place before we even get to that. So there you have it. And it really does begin with the duodenum, right? That's where the story really started. So let's go deeper on that. I want to go a little deeper on the duodenal absorption piece because this is the upstream driver that almost nobody is looking at in the screen time conversation. The duodenum is the first 25 centimeters of the small intestine, immediately distal to the stomach. It is the primary absorption site for some of the most critical micronutrients in human physiology. Iron is absorbed in the duodenum and proximal jejunum through DMT1, divalent metal transporter 1, on the apical surface of the enterocyte, right? So the enterocyte are the intestinal cells. And they're shaped in such a part in the apex, right? So there's a little spot there that absorbs the metals. Zinc is absorbed primarily in the duodenum and proximal jejunum, the second part of the small intestine, through ZIP4 transporters. Folate is absorbed in the duodenum and upper jejunum. Calcium is absorbed primarily in the duodenum through active vitamin D dependent transport. B12 absorption begins with intrinsic factor binding in the stomach and is completed in the terminal ileum. But the duodenal environment affects the upstream steps, right? So those things don't happen if there's inflammation in the gut. Now consider what compromises duodenal function. chronic inflammation from food sensitivities, particularly gluten sensitivity and celiac disease, which damages the duodenal villi specifically, NSAID use, which strips the mucosal protective layer, gut dysbiosis, which alters the pH and microbial balance of the duodenal environment, chronic stress, which reduces splanchnic blood flow and impairs absorptive capacity, and low stomach acid. How many people are on proton pump inhibitors? Hypochlorhydria, which reduces the acidification of chyme entering the duodenum and impairs the ionization of minerals like iron and zinc, turning them into positively or negatively charged particles, making them less available for transport, right? If they're not charged, it's really hard to transport them. A child or adolescent with any of these conditions, and many have more than one, is quietly failing to absorb the nutrients that their brain needs to make dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and the myelin that insulates the axons carrying those signals, which make the signals go faster. Demyelination is a very terrible thing. They are eating food, they're eating food, the food contains the right things, and the right things are passing right on through without being absorbed.
So how can we tell if there's a duodenal absorption problem versus a dietary intake problem?
Yeah, good question. If a patient has adequate dietary intake of iron and protein, but persistently low ferritin despite supplementation, that's an absorption red flag. So we might have them do a blood test, and we would see that their ferritin and their transferrin saturation rate are both low. And we might say, okay, well, let's supplement this child and let's give them uh, 60, 90 days and let's supplement them. For example, Blood Builder, Mega Foods Blood Builder is one way to make sure that you really get a lot of iron in there. If we don't see a change in that ferritin, right, in their iron stores, then we know it's an absorption problem because we've specifically gone out of our way to say, hey, let's add this in. Let's give this child a B vitamin, or let's give them this. For example, if they have B vitamin deficiency, microcytic anemia, et cetera, or macrocytic anemia. So there you have it. So that's one of the ways that we do that. That's the absorption red flag. So if they're supplementing with iron and their ferritin isn't rising at the expected rate of 10 to 20 nanograms per milliliter per month, right? Something is blocking absorption. The most common culprits are subclinical celiac disease, chronic NSAID use, H. pylori infection, right? Out of whack, low stomach acid. There can be various other things. Too much inflammation in the intestinal tract. Something they're eating. Too much sugar.
Is that common among children and youth, like H. pylori or?
Everyone has H.
NSAID?
pylori in their intestinal tract. It's just whether or not it overgrows. And again, back to childhood, stomach flu, intestinal flus, those really beat up the gut. And actually, sometimes people do get small ulcers, and those ulcers will bleed only mildly. But then the presence of blood in the intestinal tract and the inflammation from the ulcer will be enough to disrupt the absorption of iron. So it doesn't have to be a huge problem. It can be a small one, but that small one just makes the whole gut so that it doesn't absorb.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, not as uncommon as we might think. Stool calprotectin can screen for intestinal inflammation. It's a specific test, a stool test. And celiac serology, tissue transglutamase immunoglobulin A, should be checked in any patient with persistent iron deficiency that doesn't respond to supplementation, particularly kids. But we want to make sure: do you have primary inflammation of the intestinal tract from celiac? Okay, so I have a patient case, Liam, a 15-year-old with screen addiction and academic decline. The referral from the patients: he's addicted to his phone, can't stop gaming. Grades have dropped from AB to CD, and he won't do his homework, falls asleep in class. The parents took his phone away, and he became depressed, right? Previous psych eval had been suggested and had suggested ADHD, and they had begun him on stimulant medication 6 months ago with minimal benefit. So the kid's still not coming around, which tells you it's not ADHD. History taken straight from the patient. He sleeps 8 to 9 hours, but he wakes up. He just feels more tired in the morning, right? Goes to bed at 11, screen in bed until about midnight, heavy legs at night. He says they feel weird, not painful. Like I asked him, he goes, yeah, my legs, they just feel like really heavy. It's like they weigh a lot. and he feels like he has to move them, right? So classic restless leg syndrome. Eats a lot of processed food, cereal, pasta, chicken nuggets, energy drinks, like it's all the parents can get him to eat. Chronic low-grade stomach pain, right? Once you ask him, he kind of describes, oh, that's just normal. My stomach always hurts a bit. Bowel habits are irregular, right? Like, when do you go to the bathroom? Well, whenever. It's like, gets in trouble with the teachers because he's trying to go to the bathroom at odd times. So through his, asked the doctor to order labs, and do some follow-up, like some deeper labs, right? Looked at ferritin, 18 nanograms per milliliter, right? Uh, that's the labs kind of in that normalish range for a kid, but you could tell neurologically depleted. Transferrin saturation rate of 13%, serum zinc 62 micrograms per deciliter. That's a low normal. 25 OH vitamin D 24, right? That's too low. C-reactive protein was 2.4, mildly elevated, but not past that 3 that we normally go, oh my gosh, here's an obvious one. And the doc did check for celiac tissue transglutamase, immunoglobulin A negative, stool calprotectin mildly elevated, confirming subclinical intestinal inflammation. So we know the kid's got mild inflammation. Structural exam, definitely forward head with chronic upper cervical restriction, suboccipital muscles dense, right? Those temporal bones didn't move. That cranial base didn't really move. Hyoid was a problem. Cranial base was basically compressed. Tissue tart, right? When we check the consistency, chronic autonomic dysregulation pattern, as we described in previous episodes, right? His tissue's more mushy, not really responsive, real touchy to, doesn't like being touched too much. So the clinical reasoning is that Liam does not have screen addiction. He has a dopamine supply chain failure. Iron deficiency at the enzymatic level, right? Ferritin at 18 equals tyrosine hydroxylase impairment. Zinc insufficiency affecting dopamine receptor function. But, right, so he might have enough. When he does have enough dopamine, his receptors are just desensitized. They're like, they don't resensitize as they're supposed to. Vitamin D deficiency contributing to gut barrier dysfunction, subclinical gut inflammation impairing duodenal nutrient absorption. He's eating food but not absorbing the cofactors his brain needs, if they're in the food he's eating. Restless legs confirming brain iron deficiency, right? We know his brain is lagging behind his body in iron. Certainly his fragmented sleep from the restless legs and the screen disrupted circadian rhythm. We know he has impaired glymphatic clearance, progressive dopamine signaling degradation, right? There you have it. We know that his dopamine signaling is not working right. So the phone isn't the primary problem. The phone is only the stimulus cheap enough to keep his depleted dopamine system above the threshold for minimal engagement. When the phone was removed, he basically collapsed, went into depression, not because of withdrawal, but because nothing else in the environment provided enough stimulation to maintain function in a depleted brain. So the treatment plan obviously was iron repletion, right? Ferrous bisglycinate and vitamin C. Zinc, 15 milligrams daily. Vitamin D, 4,000 IU daily. Really try to pump that up here in the Northwest. We don't get a lot of sun. We are today, but it's not a regular. Let's put it that way. Okay, dietary restructuring, protein at every meal, right? And this is the same with those people who are going on GLP-1s. They effectively can get some of this if they get too much GLP-1 or the Ozempic or some people, remember, it's all about figuring out what's the right level for the person so that they don't get inflammation. So there are some people who get inflammation from taking the GLP-1, even though that's what it's supposed to help get rid of.
Interesting.
Yeah. So protein at every meal, reduced processed food, gut healing protocol, right? L-glutamine, elimination of inflammatory triggers, all the sugar, all the high fructose corn syrup. So manual therapy, right? Try and get that skull working right. Make sure that his upper cervicals and everything, that he can drain his skull. Make sure his thoracic inlets are working properly. Suboccipital release, autonomic regulating techniques. We went after his kidneys and we released his small intestine. Made sure that a lot of that tenderness in there and that he knew how to lay on a ball, relieve that. Sleep protocol, screens out of the bedroom by 10 p.m. Not as punishment, but more as circadian support. With a replacement activity, you give them an audiobook, so you can listen to the audiobook. Drawing, reading with a book light, right? They can take a book and people fall asleep with reading a book all the time. It's not overly stimulating, so it won't keep them up. So after 8 weeks, ferritin 36, like twice, doubled. Restless legs resolved, sleeping more deeply. Parent reports less movement at night, right? They can hear him moving around in his bed and they're saying, we don't hear that. Energy described as 50% better, which is a ton coming from a 15-year-old. Beginning to shift activities spontaneously. He started drawing again without prompting, screen time still present, but self-limited to approximately 2 hours, down from the 5 to 6 he was at, right? Because now he's enjoying other activities because he can change from one thing to the other. At 16 weeks, ferritin was 62, right? We're really, grades have returned to that B average. Stimulant medication tapered and discontinued. Went to back to the doctor. They slowly got him off of it. No deterioration in focus. Screen use now approximately 90 minutes daily, self-regulated. Reports feeling like my brain works again. I thought was interesting. So key learning. What looked like ADHD and screen addiction was a dopamine supply chain failure, rooted in iron deficiency, zinc insufficiency, gut malabsorption, and compounded by sleep disruption and glymphatic impairment. The phone was the symptom, the duodenum was the cause, right?
Very interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's just crazy.
And just changing diet and manual therapy helped him kind of break that vicious cycle.
Exactly.
Looks like. That's very
Exactly.
cool.
And you're not going to get results with that with just drugs alone. They're just not designed to do that. So
Right. The drugs aren't going to fix the small intestine. In fact, a lot of ADHD medications make the small intestine component worse. So then they need more medication. And then their symptoms creep back and it's like, oh, did you not take it? Take it closer together, take more, take a higher dose. I mean, from a pharmaceutical sales standpoint, that's perfect. The patients need more and more and more of this stuff. But from a patient, clinician standpoint, that's horrible. Okay. Now, adults are not immune. I want to be clear that this isn't just a pediatric conversation. Adults are experiencing the same supply-side dopamine depletion for the same metabolic reasons. And the screen behavior is the same. It just gets called different things. Doom scrolling, news addiction, late night phone checking, late night email checking, the inability to stop watching a streaming series even when you're exhausted. How many people come in and say, oh, I'm so tired because last night I watched the entire season of whatever. And you're like, wow.
even the commercials are
It's like
representing that.
5 or
Everybody's like
6
wasted
hours.
on a couch.
I know they want you to be. I was like, yeah, this
You're
works
like,
for
no.
us. I don't know who they think is going to be able to make money to pay for their services. It's like, you guys are ruining your
Also that.
customers. Exactly. Okay, so the adult version has additional contributing factors that compound the pediatric ones. Chronic occupational stress increases cortisol, which impairs dopamine receptor sensitivity, right? So again, that's that stimulation later at night is bad for you. Exercising earlier in the day, making sure that your cortisol spikes early in the day so that by the end of the day, it's dropping so you can go to sleep and so you don't get fractionated sleep. Let's see, chronic occupational stress increases cortisol, which impairs dopamine receptor sensitivity and reduces iron absorption. Alcohol, even moderate intake, disrupts sleep architecture, specifically suppressing slow wave sleep and impairing glymphatic clearance. Statin medications, as we've discussed in prior episodes, impairs the CoQ10 synthesis, which reduces mitochondrial efficiency in the neurons that produce dopamine. Let's say that again. Statin medications impair CoQ10 synthesis, which reduces mitochondrial efficiency in the neurons that produce dopamine. Perimenopause in women produces estrogen fluctuations that directly affect dopamine receptor density in the prefrontal cortex, adding a hormonal layer to the depletion. The 48-year-old professional who describes herself as unable to stop scrolling Instagram at 11 p.m. is experiencing the same neurological phenomena as the 15-year-old gaming until midnight. Neither is addicted to dopamine. Both are using the cheapest available stimulus to maintain baseline neural activation in a depleted system, and both will respond to the same supply-side intervention. Restore the metabolic infrastructure that produces dopamine, restore the sleep architecture that resensitizes its receptors, and restore the glymphatic function that clears the waste that accumulates around the neurons that make it. Okay, patient, 52-year-old nurse with news addiction and insomnia. Presentation described by her husband as addicted to her phone. Scrolls news and social media from 9 p.m. until 12:30 to 1 a.m. nightly. Reports she just can't stop. Every time she puts it down, she picks it back up within minutes. And there's the key, right? They'll finally stop themselves or something will come up and they go right back to it because they just don't have the energy to take on another task. She's tried app blockers, digital sunset rules, leaving the phone in another room. Nothing works. Also, chronic fatigue related, 7 out of 10, brain fog, 20 pounds weight gain over the last 3 years, Her hair is thinning, cold hands and feet, perimenopause with irregular cycles, right? I mean, this is classic. So we did her labs. Ferritin was 21, lab normal, but neurologically depleted, right? We've talked about that between a 50 and a 100. Free T3, 2.5, which is a low normal. TSH was 2.8, normal. Reverse T3 was 22. Now that's elevated, and the whole point there is reverse T3. When you have T4, your body splits the T4, and it either becomes T3 or reverse T3. Reverse T3 is the unusable T3. It's an unusable thyroid hormone, right? Your body can't use that. So it's a way to keep you from getting too much of T3, too like hyperthyroid. So it's actually built into the system to break apart somewhat evenly into the two. But all of a sudden you start getting more reverse T3, which is unusable. So you have less available T3 for use. So you basically have functional hypothyroidism. Now our CRP was 3.6, which is elevated, definitely above that 3 that we look for. Vitamin D, 28. Night shift work history, 12 years, right? So she's a night shift worker. Chronic circadian disruption. So the interpretation is full metabolic triad failure. Ferritin, thyroid, mitochondria with 12 years of circadian disruption. Brain dopamine production impaired by iron-starved tyrosine hydroxylase. Dopamine receptors chronically desensitized from years of fragmented sleep. Glymphatic clearance impaired from poor sleep architecture, right? The news addiction is a dopamine-depleted brain clinging to the easiest available stimulus. So again, the treatment, iron repletion, selenium for T4 to T3 conversion to keep it out of the reverse T3. Vitamin D, sleep focus protocol, melatonin timing, magnesium, really we're kind of moving more towards magnesium than melatonin. Light exposure management, right? Of course, because of her off shift. Cranial and vagal manual therapy, right? We have to make sure that vagus nerve down through her entire small intestine is working properly and getting that signal up through her neck with the aberration with a change in her estrogen cycle. Her vagus nerve is sensitized. So a little bit of dietary restructuring, making sure she's getting the right things. More fiber, obviously, right? At 12 weeks, ferritin was 48. Free T3 was 3.1. Sleep improving. Falling asleep by 10:30 p.m. most nights. Phone use in the evening dropped from 3+ hours to approximately 40 minutes without any restriction protocol. She reports, I just don't feel a pull anymore. I get bored and put it down. Perfect. Right.
That's great.
She doesn't need that
That's very
stimulation.
admirable.
Yeah. So
That's awesome.
just crazy. So key learning, getting bored and putting it down is dopamine function. It's the transition signal restoring. She didn't need willpower or app blockers. She needed the neurochemical infrastructure to generate the signal that says this is no longer worth pursuing. Let's do something else. Okay.
Nice. I think there's a lot of listeners here that are going to identify with
Exactly.
with this patient example. So that's great.
Exactly. Okay. Segment 7, clinical action steps. Let me close with the practical framework. What you do with this. Reframe the conversation with families. Stop calling it dopamine addiction. Start calling it dopamine depletion. The child or adult who can't put down the phone may not have the neurochemical resources to shift gears. The screen is a symptom of the deficit, not the cause. Ideally, we would screen every patient with excessive screen use for dopamine supply chain failure. Order ferritin, not just CBC, zinc, vitamin D, and C-reactive protein. Ask about restless legs. Ask about sleep quality, GI symptoms. Check for subclinical gut inflammation if ferritin isn't rising with supplementation. And of course, we check by palpating, and we'll know right off the bat. Investigate duodenal absorption in any patient with persistent nutritional deficiency despite adequate dietary intake, right? If we give them that dietary intake and it doesn't kick in, something's wrong. Celiac serology, stool calprotectin, H. pylori testing, careful NSAID history should be a standard in the population, right? We should be asking people these questions all the time. Address the sleep architecture before expecting behavioral change. A brain that can't get consolidated slow wave sleep cannot resensitize its dopamine receptors. Screens out of the bedroom is important, but the reason isn't dopamine avoidance. It's circadian blue light management and removal of the stimulus that delays sleep onset. The replacement activity matters. Provide an alternative that is mildly engaging, but doesn't require high dopamine to sustain. Audiobooks, drawing, gentle music, right? It won't keep their brain going. It'll let their brain just calm down and go, oh, I'm so tired, forget it. Treat the upper cervical and cranial base, the whole cranium. In these patients, forward head posture from screen use creates chronic cranial base compression that may impair cerebrospinal fluid dynamics and glymphatic function. Certainly, thoracic inlet is part of this. Suboccipital release, temporal bone treatment, cranial base, OA, sphenoid mobilizations are directly relevant, not just for the musculoskeletal complaint, but for the supporting neurometabolic recovery. And think in terms of supply restoration, not demand restriction. Restriction is appropriate for platform safety, age-appropriate content, and health boundaries, but restriction alone in a depleted brain is not treatment. Treatment is restoring the dopamine supply chain, iron repletion, zinc supplementation, gut healing, sleep restoration, and the manual therapy that supports the autonomic and cerebrospinal fluid environment in which all of this operates. Track improvement by watching for the return of spontaneous transitions. The clinical marker of dopamine restoration is not reduced screen time by the clock, it's the return of spontaneous gear shifting. The patient starts a new hobby without prompting, puts the phone down and picks up a book without a rule requiring it, wakes up and gets out of bed without a 45-minute struggle. That's dopamine working. That's a transition, right? Those people who just keep hitting the sleep alarm, they're not getting proper sleep. And that's the transition signal returning. Okay. So, to end this out, dopamine is not the villain. It never was. Dopamine is the molecule that gives you the ability to choose, to transition, to say, this activity is done, and now I'm going to go do something else. It's the neurological currency of flexibility, initiative, and forward momentum. When that currency is depleted by iron deficiency, by poor duodenal absorption, by fractionated sleep, by glymphatic failure, by the self-reinforcing loop of depletion that tightens a little more with every night of poor rest, the brain cannot generate the signal to shift gears. And the cheapest stimulus in the environment becomes the default, not because it's irresistibly rewarding, but because there is nothing left to fuel a different choice. The media narrative that dopamine is being hijacked by your phone gets the direction of causality exactly backward. The depleted brain isn't being hijacked, it's reaching for the only life raft available, and taking away the life raft without fixing the hole in the boat is not a solution. Fix the supply chain, restore the iron, heal the gut, rebuild the sleep, clear the waste, treat the cranial base, and then watch what happens when a brain that finally has enough dopamine to generate transitions starts choosing to do exactly that.
I love this. And I think it's going to be really great and it's going to be hard maybe for parents to accept because they've been so trained to think it's such a bad thing. But when, and they're just desperate to do something that is going to help their children and help them to be successful and not, sabotage their future and so forth. Right. So if we can explain it to them and then help them understand in a way that takes the fear away and say, hey, oh, also we actually have a remedy for this and actually a plan and we know what to do and where and at what points to intervene, especially if we can get labs, things like that will help. And then, they'll see it in the changes in the posture, in how they sleep and all those things. I think it's going to be, if we can get them to understand that, the difference of don't blame the messenger, it's going to be okay. We can do something about it. So.
Right. And I think that's exactly. Go ahead.
I was going to say that these are all like holistic remedies, right? It's not just a pharmaceutical. It's looking at the entire body, brain, gut, diet, rest, all together to make the body work optimally. And that's what I love about this approach.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's exactly the right note to end on. Compassion and mechanism, not blame, and bringing the body back to functioning properly. So if this episode was useful, share it with a colleague, a parent, a teacher. Leave us a review and send your questions and topic ideas through nealpt@pursuitpt.com. I'm Neal and Neal with Autumn and Brent Mayberry. Keep paying attention to the signals, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Neal.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of OsteoSignal. For more information, visit PursuitPT.com or PursuitPerformanceTraining.com. Want to show your support for the podcast? Like this episode, hit that follow or subscribe button and leave us a comment or review. Remember, this podcast is for informational purposes only. Please consult your healthcare provider regarding any medical procedure. Copyright 2026, Neal O'Neal, PT.